Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX, and things are about to get lit on this channel. So many of you have asked if I can try my hardest to interview the legal titan and historical maverick author, Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, and guess what? We pulled it off for you. So Advocate Ngcukaitobi, thank you so much for joining SMWX.
No, it's a pleasure. I was looking forward to this interview myself.
This office, I don't know how much it's seen in the last just year alone, but this is kind of like the union buildings, I guess.
No, I think there will be intense competition for that. So I'd rather say perhaps which one is the big wing of the union building?
Right.
The west.
This is, yeah, okay, so this is...
Perhaps the smaller wing.
No, it's amazing. I was checking out your bookshelf, which is quite... I couldn't look at any of these old law things, but the normal books I was really interested in. And I suppose that brings us onto... There's so much we could talk about. But I just wanted to ask you firstly from a personal perspective. I remember the first time I ever saw you was actually at the Marikana Commission.
Yeah.
And
forgot about that, yeah.
Yeah, and I was like, oh, there's this like young advocate. Wow, cool.
Yeah.
5 years later,
yeah,
you have been catapulted onto the forefront of South Africa's literary scene with your amazing book, and you are one of the leading advocates in the country. And that, I was checking how old you are recently, and it feels kind of like you're older than you are because of all that you're doing.
Yeah.
But how's that been for you? Because the last 5 years have been sensational.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's very difficult from where I sit. I mean, because I don't sort of like sit in self-evaluation in that respect. But I mean, the fact for me is that I've basically worked all my life as a lawyer. And so it sort of feels like a continuous, unbroken period. The only thing that has changed is that my work is now in sort of public spotlight. But in relation to what I do every day, which is to come to the office, to see clients, to help them with their problems and to go to court to argue one way or the other, there is continuity there that is unbroken. But it is true that in the past 5 years, probably 6 years, the work that I do is now much more public. So that's the only distinction that I would say, is that there is an interest in what we do. But that's not me as such. It is that the legal landscape now occupies a center stage in the public imagination, largely because of the taking of political questions and giving them a legal flavor. So many questions today that are routinely argued in court, if you brought them to court 10 years ago, the judges would have probably laughed you out of court. But if you bring those cases today to court, courts are much more receptive to listening to those arguments. So it's not me as such. I think a whole range of us who do the work that connects politics to law are suddenly finding themselves on people's television screens, in their bedrooms and in their sitting rooms in ways that were not possible 20 years ago, largely because I think the complexion of law is changing. Law is increasingly getting into a political space, and the bounds of constitutionalism are growing and growing, you know, every day, and concepts that were sacred to the executive and sacred to parliament are no longer sacred and are no longer exclusively parliamentary. Is that a good thing? I guess it is for lawyers.
So you're happy?
No,
Yeah.
I think that what we are witnessing is an actualization of the basic premise of the Constitution: transparency, accountability, the rule of law. It was difficult, I think, 20 years ago to figure out what those concepts mean. But it's now much easier that once all public power is subject to judicial scrutiny, what is happening is the translation of that concept into some kind of practical manifestation on the ground. I mean, the idea that, for instance, a president of the country could be called to account to the Constitutional Court about the personal usage of funds, like it happened in March 2016 in the Nkandla case, was probably unthinkable during Mandela's era. Although, of course, it's probably Mandela who started the possibility of subjecting himself to judicial scrutiny with his decision to appoint the SARFU Commission of Inquiry. But the extent to which it has grown over time, I think, has been quite remarkable. So I would say that is the real development. And so what we then become as lawyers is just conduits, instruments, interlocutors.
And there are some, actually internationally and domestically, who think that this is maybe not such a great thing. I was listening to the Wreath lectures by UK.
Yes, Jonathan Sumption.
Yeah. When he was talking about the expanding empire of law in the UK context. It seems as though you're painting a similar picture in South Africa. But he was kind of warning against too much judicial power over political decisions. Do you think we're at a point of potential overreach, or are people who are a bit worried about that jumping the gun?
No, I mean, I think that I don't think we are at a point of overreach, certainly in South Africa. Because if you think at what the issues are that are coming to the Constitutional Court, or even in the High Courts for that matter, it's instances that manifest a collapse within the executive branch or a collapse within the legislative branch. So take, for instance, the secret ballot case. What was at issue in the secret ballot case was the failure by the Speaker to exercise a discretion which the Constitution allows her, when she completely refused to allow a secret ballot and misread the provision that allowed the secret ballot to say that it didn't allow the secret ballot. So the case ultimately generates a lot of political interest, but at its core, there is a simple legal question. Does she have a discretion in relation to the clause properly construed? The same thing with the Ngandla case. It generates a lot of political heat. But if you actually look at what the light is, it's actually quite simple. The Constitution provides in Section 96 that no member of the executive may place their interest in conflict with their official interests. And so that is eminently a justiciable question. So the questions that are coming to the courts are questions that should, in fact, be coming to the courts. But they are questions that are illustrative of a larger problem, which is the collapse of the executive and the sometimes failure by the legislature to play its constitutional role. I usually think that at the forefront of constitutional implementation should be the executive. The executive should be the first branch to translate the Constitution into executive action. But it should be overseen by the legislature through passing of laws, and that the last branch should be the judiciary. But there are gaps with the first and the second, and hence the judiciary plays a much more active role. But I would say also in relation to the UK experience, the same debate was happening last week in the Brexit context.
Absolutely.
And
I saw you sharing the link on Twitter.
Yeah, of course. I suppose in that sense.
Yeah.
So if you look there in the UK, there have been diametrically opposed outcomes. In Scotland, they found that the question was justiciable. The question of prorogation by the Prime Minister was justiciable. In England and Wales, the High Court found it was not justiciable. It was interesting to watch the exchanges from the bench. I mean, people like Lady Hale actually think the question is justiciable. What they may be worried about is what remedy should be granted. So even though someone like Jonathan Sumption is sounding a warning, the actual practice on the ground there is again to move towards the expansion of the constitutional empire.
Well, when you say that, you cause me to think of the counter that often isn't put, which is, what if there's judicial underreach and the executive breaks the law, but the judiciary feels too scared to dip into the political terrain and then starts to make political calculations, thereby underreaching and allowing the law to be broken? That surely can't persist.
I mean, that is the other side of the coin, is that where we are, I mean, I think the problem we have in this country certainly is the failure of the executive to take seriously the constitutional project, because it should be at the forefront of the analysis, but also interpretation of the constitutional project. And the same with the legislature. That's the structure of the Constitution. So the first body that should decide what the Constitution requires is the executive. But contrary to the expected sort of constitutional norm, what we find is the executive going the opposite way. And so the cases that come are cases trying to stop the executive from breaching the law, alternatively cases that are trying to compel them to comply with the Constitution. But I think where there is a gap in constitutional terms is their failure to understand that the structure of the Constitution requires the executive to be at the forefront of constitutional interpretation.
So I feel like we could just go on this and Lord Sumption's lectures for an hour, but I wanted to come back to the personal as well, because you said, you know, this is an interesting moment for prominent lawyers in the country to the extent that legal issues are so much at the forefront. And what's that like on a personal level? Because I've had some experience watching, you know, 1 minute you take one case, you're everybody's favorite. The next minute you take another case and suddenly there's a conspiracy in the opposite direction. We spoke to Advocate Skakane on this show as well, who's, you know, been at the center of a number of controversial cases. And that can put burdens on advocates, especially when there's public pressure. Have you felt, you know, the pressure when you're, you know, having to take on sometimes diametrically opposing cases because that's your responsibility and your role as an advocate?
Yes, at the moment I am taking a diametrically opposed.
That seems to be the order of the day for everyone.
Look, although it is true that, I mean, we must take whatever case comes according to the so-called Cabreng rule. The reality is that we do have a measure of choice about what work we ultimately do. I happen to take a particular brand of cases and for a particular category of clients. And then from time to time that is then broken. And so from that point of view, it doesn't always feel like it's too much of a pressure because I'm not always having to be in a sort of conflicting position. But I do think that at a personal level, it does put one under some pressure. But I would say that our if I took political cases, so let us make an example. I act for the president of the ANC, and then in the next case, I act for the president of the EFF. And so they are on, you know, polar opposites of the political spectrum. The fact is that our politicians are relatively mature about those questions. We can mention Julius Malema in particular. He is someone who is actually very mature about understanding what role lawyers play in society. The same thing can be said about the president of the country, Cyril Ramaphosa. He is someone very mature about what the Constitution requires and entitles lawyers to do.
Even so after your line of questioning at the Marikana Commission.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I actually never watched that video afterwards, you know, but...
Wow,
yeah,
I did.
Yeah, but I sort of thought, you know, I wasn't, unfair to the president. Well, at the time, the deputy president, I thought that the questions were fair. I mean, of course, they were robust, and I think once I got the answers that I wanted, I moved on.
No, absolutely, and I think it's fantastic. I've obviously myself seen, you know, how difficult it can be to, you know, choose who to represent, and I think while politicians are often very mature, the public is not as mature often, and there are burdens placed on lawyers which are, in my view, often undue.
No, I can't deny that. I think that is absolutely true. But I think that if we don't insist on an independent profession of advocates, which is capable of representing anyone under whatever circumstances. I can make various examples from history, recent history and old history. I remember speaking to George Bezos, who told me that there was a point at which lawyers were very reluctant to represent Nelson Mandela because he was regarded as an outlaw, and that it was the exception rather than norm to represent him. But of course in the 90s and the 2000s, it was a scramble to represent Nelson Mandela because the intervening 30-40 years had changed the man from a terrorist to statesman. There was also a point when it was hard to find lawyers to represent Julius Malema shortly after his expulsion from the ANC, and I remember lawyers who took the case. I mean, Sikakane himself, Vincent Malega, I think Dalimpofu actually might have been involved in the case. And even when the EFF was established, you know, Julius gave the interview with the Sunday Times that there was a sense of in which people were reluctant. That is when I came into the representation of the EFF. So I think unless we insist on an independent, critical, and robust legal profession, it's very hard to see how the constitutional project can be sustained and kept together. And so I think we should refuse the public pressure. And because if we started pandering to the public pressure, the effect, the negative ramifications will be experienced by the constitutional project as a whole. So I spoke recently in Cape Town about the fact that Jacob Zuma, has become someone rather unpopular to act for, but I was in that context praising our colleagues, Thabani Masuku, Moses Kakane, who've taken on the representation of Jacob Zuma, regardless of what we might think about him right now, So things were not always like that. So things change. I mean, there is, of course, now the views taken about what the EFF does represent, and quite critical views. But a lawyer should never allow those to influence the decision. It's always, and Arthur Charles pointed this, it's usually those people at the margins, the social outcasts, social and political outcasts, I would add, that deserve more representation than those that are in the mainstream. So I think we must actively resist any kind of public pressure to prescribe who we should act for.
Well, part of what has been controversial about the EFF is the way that they've reintroduced the land debate into South Africa, which seems to have moved gears in terms of its priority in South Africa. And you have been at the center of questions of land, both from your writing to your legal work, both as an advocate, but also most recently as a judge. And so I wanted to turn to land now. And let's start with the Section 25 question, but then we'll move on to some of the points you've been making which go deeper than Section 25, because it does seem that the debate has been stuck there. What's your position on Section 25? Is it absolutely crucial that it's amended to include expropriation without compensation, or should we leave it alone?
No, it's not crucial at all. If the goal is to achieve expropriation without compensation, that goal can be achieved without amending Section 25. It seems to me, as a legal question at the very least, as opposed to a political question, it seems to me as a legal question that expropriation without compensation can be achieved in one of three ways. One way is by passing legislation to expressly limit the right to compensation that in Section 25, right, if that exists. And that right can be found in Section 36 of the Constitution. Any right in the Constitution can be limited. So if those people argue that there is an entrenched right to compensation, that can be limited by passing national legislation. And if you pass national legislation, there will simply be no point to the amendment. The second instance in which an expropriation without compensation can be achieved is where a judge, in their determination of just an equitable remedy, decides that in a particular setting there should be no compensation paid. And that is within the framework of what justice and equity actually mean. And the third one is by a direct amendment to the Constitution itself. The first two of these mechanisms have simply never been tested in South Africa, because we work, and I think we've been on the extreme side, we've worked on the basis that A, compensation is constitutionally compulsory, and B, when compensation is paid, it should be market-based. So I gave a judgment about 4 years ago when I started acting in the Land Claims Court, which debunked the myth of a market-based compensation system. And so even though I still accepted compensation as a principle, but I wrote a judgment that found that market-based compensation is not part and parcel of the Constitution. Market-based is the so-called willing buyer, willing seller. Now that came purely as a consequence of an executive decision, a policy decision taken by the Department of Land Affairs many, many years ago, that when they acquire land for restitution or land reform purposes, they would do so through the application of market-based strategies. So is it crucial? No, it's not crucial. Legislation can be passed, judicial determinations can be made, and indeed the Constitution itself might be amended. But in either of those, constitutional amendment is not a prerequisite to attain EWC. But I also don't see EWC as central to land reform. It's a tiny part of land reform. In fact, compensation hardly accounts for the problems with the land reform in this country. There are very few cases that are pending because of compensation. Many cases are pending and unresolved for a whole range of other reasons which have little to do with compensation. So I'm afraid the energy that is expended on compensation is unjustified by the nature of the problem.
That's a really fascinating take. I've never thought about it from the perspective of the different routes you could go to pursue compensation or a lack of compensation, and realizing that the Constitution isn't the only route.
Yes.
A number of judgments, one of which you were the central author of, but there's also been land questions raised at the Constitution recently, have shone a light on the major executive deficiencies in the process of land reform. And this is something that you've constantly said needs to be foregrounded, as opposed even to constitutional questions on the one hand, or even historical on the other, the failure of the state to actually implement.
Yes.
Take us through your view of how the state is failing and how these different judgments paint a picture of the failure of executive infrastructure as it relates to land in South Africa.
I mean, what I do think that the land debate has been sort of taken over by legalese and by lawyers and by sort of constitutionalists. But the land debate is truly political. What it requires is political commitment. And the Constitution simply gives us a framework. But taking that framework from the promise to reality requires political will. And I think that's what we've actually been missing. It's been a total collapse of the institutions, but also a lack of concerted political interest in resolving the land question. So the first thing we need is a paradigm shift and I wouldn't say that the government is deliberately neglecting the question of land, but I think that there is a certain level of carelessness, a certain level of negligence when it comes to the land issue. It's simply not a priority. All of these cases you're talking about illustrate exactly that problem. So let's go to the question of the institutional collapse. When 1994 happened, the promise was that the government would set up key institutions that would be responsible to implement all of the three programs of land reform: security of tenure, restitution, and redistribution, because those are the three elements of land reform. But they would be driven or underpinned by three key institutions. The first would be the Commission for Restitution of Land Rights. The second would be the Department of Land Affairs. And the third would be overseen by the judicial arm, which would be the Land Claims Court. So if you take a stock about where we are, the Department of Land Affairs over time has just been allowed to collapse. It's certainly been consigned into a wasteland. The officials in the department come and go. It's been broken apart, rural development added, split, agriculture added, split, and then reconstituted again. And different ministers have come and gone. The consequence is that there is policy incoherence. So you start off with one strategy, but the next minister develops a different strategy. But insofar as the department itself as a viable instrument or institution for land reform, what you find is there is a massive shortage of people, a massive shortage of skill, massive shortage of talent. And then if you go to the commission, we experience more or less the same crisis, the crisis of absence of personnel. And again, the lack of continuity. They began with certain projects in 1994. Over time, those projects have largely collapsed. And if you then go to the third arm, which is the judicial arm, the Land Claims Court, I've had some experience. I sometimes feel for judges who accept appointment to the Land Claims Court, because the one thing is that the Land Claims Court was designed to be a 5-year court. And the reason why that was so is because in the Ready to Govern document of the ANC passed in 1992, 1993, I can't remember. The idea was that the land reform project would be fast-tracked in the first 5 years of Nelson Mandela's government. And so they designed a court whose duration would be 5 years, and the appointment of judges would also be 5 years. because they thought they would be able in the first 5 years to achieve a 30% redistribution of commercial land, agriculturally commercial land. They discovered that it was a problem to do it. And I think the statistics show that by that stage, the end of Nelson Mandela's tenure, only 2% of land had in fact been restituted. The numbers now are difficult to work out, but some people are putting at 7%, 9%, etc. In fact, the University of the Western Cape suggested that if we continued according to the current trajectory, we're looking at 140 years to restitute only 30%. So what's clear is that the system is not working at all. And hence, my focus has not so much been an obsession with what the Constitution provides, but with what are the institutions that we need to drive sustainable land reform. And that's why I've come to the two conclusions. The one is what we need. We need an institution that's underpinned by the rule of law, because what we don't want is a chaotic system that ultimately works against the very intended beneficiaries.
Sure.
But what we need also is a massive realignment of institutions that will be driving land reform. I mean, this idea of having a chaotic revolution, I mean, ultimately works against the interests of the intended beneficiaries of the revolution. In order for the revolution to work, it needs to be driven by proper state institutions, and that is where the problems have been. And so to come back then to your question about what these cases have highlighted. So take one case, which is the Hilton case about labor tenants. So
this is Justice Cameron's...
Yes, the Constitutional Court judgment. In fact, it comes all the way from the Land Claims Court. Justice Ngcukaitobi from the Land Claims Court gave an order that said the department has failed to resolve labor tenancy claims over such a long period of time. And the collapse has been so spectacular that he had to appoint someone else as an outsider, this person called a special master, to oversee all of the outstanding claims for labor tenants. The Supreme Court of Appeal overturned the judgment on the basis that the Land Claims Court has no power to make an order saying a departmental function must be shifted to a special master. The Constitutional Court reinstated the judgment of the Land Claims Court, saying that the extent of the collapse is staggering. And in fact, it's a wonderful judgment to read, because for the first time the court drills into what the bureaucratic failures have been and makes reference to Deputy President Motlante's panel report, which actually says the problems we are having, if we are looking for evidence for the problems we are having have a lot to do with the system that is not working, And so it actually means even if we resolved the Section 25 issue, if we don't have systems to drive land reform, we will come back to the same problem 20 years later. So that's the judgment that assigns or reassigns executive power into a master. So take another case by the Constitutional Court, a judgment by Justice Madlanga, also a most remarkable judgment, not on labor tenancy claims, but on restitution, which again highlights the problem of the collapse of restitution and says that the department, the Commission for Restitution of Land Rights, must now report regularly to the Land Claims Court, and the Land Claims Court is playing a supervisory role, right? And so take the one case you were asking me about, the judgment I gave in the District 6 case.
Yeah,
I mean,
talk about excoriating.
Yeah, it really makes your heart break, because
we actually had a news insert on it, and just the number of people who are messaging us on the channel from District 6 about a 25 year failure to even do the most basic things was quite heart-wrenching.
Yes, exactly. And most of these are detailed and catalogued in the judgment. The judgment was, about issues of contempt and personal costs, etc. But none of those things actually made sense unless you went through the detail of setting out the story of the 1960s and the 1970s, which is where dispossession happened. And one of the things about District 6 is it shows you, dispossession was a violent process, and the violence didn't end with the colonial conquest. It actually continued throughout the apartheid period. And that's why it's legitimate for people in District 6 to expect that when the new government comes in, they would be among the first to have their interests prioritized. And that story about District 6, again, I don't think the government is deliberately ignoring them, but I think there's just a sense of extreme level of recklessness and just carelessness about what are the priorities. I mean, what are the priorities of government if it is not to return land? Because what's clear about that case is that they just never prioritized it at all. And the order that I suggested there is that the matter again needs to be reassigned to the deputy presidency. You can combine the three judgments and look at what is at the center of all of them. At the center of all of them has been a degree of culpability of the state, which fails to do the things that the law says must be done. Not only the law says must be done, they themselves promise every election that their priority will be to resolve people's concerns. So the constitutional project, in fact, gets to evaporate in the hands of the executive because of unfulfilled promises. And that's why I think over time and with the experience, I do think that we have invested a lot of time on the issue of compensation and neglected, where the real pain is.
Well, we've dealt with the question of land, but I just finally wanted to come to another key question in our democracy that you've been at the center of, which is this question of freedom of expression.
Yeah.
And I think it's quite interesting because on one hand, in the SANEF-EFF case, you were arguing about the need for that freedom to be widened. And then you've also been involved in this crucial case with the NMF apartheid flag, where you've drawn the limits of that expression.
Yeah.
How has working on these two cases informed your view of freedom of expression, and how do you see both that it needs to be widened, but to very severe limits?
Yeah. The most fascinating thing is the historical and the comparative on expression. The Americans, because of their own history, have the sort of most wide and most unlimited version of expression. But if you went to Europe, particularly because of their experience with fascism and Hitler and the linkages they draw between speech and action, have a much more restricted ambit of freedom of expression. And in fact, they actively regulate speech, sometimes through criminal action. So if people said things that praised Hitler, in many countries like Poland, they would be locked up. Whereas in America, you can say anything you want, with very little consequences. But South Africa is closer to the European experience because what we are grappling with in South Africa is a question of a historical denial of dignity. A group of people coming from Europe occupying the country and then over 400 years deliberately denigrating the status, dignity and reputation of Africans. And once you have a constitutional project, one of the first things that you have to restore is people's dignity, the basic respect of people. The key question for me has always been, where is the balance to be struck between the ability of people to speak, because speaking also is part and parcel of the definition of what it means to be a human being, and dignity at the same time. What's clear in our constitution is what the Constitutional Court has repeatedly said in cases like Khumalo versus Olomisa, which is that expression doesn't occupy a special place in our foundation as a nation. It occupies its place alongside other important values. Most important value in this country is equality, and another important value is dignity. So insofar as expression might denigrate one's dignity and might denigrate one's right to equality, it seems to me it needs to make way for claims of equality and for claims of dignity. Because where we are in our constitutional system, we obviously apartheid as a formal legal term has ended. But apartheid in a social, political and economic sense continues. And we are not going to address it if people are not deliberately told that there are certain things that are so hurtful that they shouldn't be said to others. And so it's a question of how to create a society that is based on respect and on decency. So you can take the Nelson Mandela Foundation case, where one of the points that we make is that, certainly the points I argued, was that it's impossible for us to tell people not to be racist. And it's also impossible for the law to do that. What the law can do is to protect others from having their dignity undermined in ways that there is nothing they can do about it. There is nothing I can do about the fact that I'm black. There's nothing I can do about the fact that I may be gay, or there's nothing I can do about the fact that I may be a woman, because those are just part and parcel of those features that are innate in one's personality. And so there shouldn't be group insult based on such features. And so that, I think, has been the key question for me, is that I think that equality and dignity actually are much more important than concerns of expression. But I do think the SANEF case raises a different issue, because it's not a clash between dignity on the one hand and expression on the other, but it is a clash between political freedoms and the limitation of expression. And so the one way of looking at SANEF is to see it as a small political party trying to create space for its political activity within, I mean, of course, people will disagree with this, but within a context where the political space is narrow and is getting narrower and narrower, every day. So once you are dealing with these two rights, one is Section 19 and the other is Section 16, I would say that expression then becomes part and parcel of the arsenal of a small political party. So the point to be defended there is not the right of Malema to insult people, but it is the right of Malema to make political statements without the risk that political statements will be outlawed. It's much better for me that Malema insults the president than he gets sanctioned for insulting the president.
I'm not going to go any further on that because I'll be accused of various things. But I think I watched your arguments in the SANEF case, and I was, and your colleagues' arguments, and I was just, riveted. And I want to come on to a little bit of that to close off, which is your craft. The actual role of being an advocate, of deploying rhetoric, of turning a phrase. I think in the public protector case recently, it became clear that you had mastered that craft, and there was just this, people didn't even like necessarily the argument you were making, but they would like the way you were making it.
Yeah.
So tell us how you hone that craft, and, are there things you do to try and become better with rhetoric? Do you read? Do you listen? How do you build your arguments and hone that craft?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I don't consciously do it.
Yeah. I kind of got
that. I think that would be false modesty, perhaps false praise. Look, I think firstly, speaking and writing come from reading. Certainly speaking in court, they come from reading. So it's true that I read widely, and I read outside law. I read history, and I read European, African, American history, and good books that are, written well, are very helpful in improving one's sort of vocabulary.
So do you read them sometimes with that purpose? Like, oh wow, that's a nice way to put that. If I were to use that, that would be a nice way to kind of frame that argument.
No, I never do, but what happens actually incidentally is that when you are on your feet, some of the thoughts of the things you've been reading come in, and they can be deployed if the moment requires it. So that's the first thing, is to read widely and to read outside of law, to read philosophy, politics. Sometimes if you can master reading an economics book, you should do that. But there are books like Thomas Piketty's, which are sort of readable if you can, finish 700 pages. And then reading history. And that's the one thing. But the other thing is watching other lawyers practice, especially lawyers that you admire. So I watch, I watch Dali Mpofu. There are things he can say that I can't say, but there are also
welcome to the club.
Yeah. So things that he can say that I just know that it would not be right for me to say, and the things he can put in a particular way that I can rephrase, but to have the same sort of impact. So he is the one person I like watching when arguing. Jeremy Gauntlet is another, like watching Gauntlet. Vem Trengov is another who's sort of clinical with words and uses very few words, but uses them very effectively.
So sometimes when you're like in a case, maybe even opposing, and you see something that another counsel does, you're like, that's actually...
No, absolutely. I am always, especially people that I sort of admire.
Yeah.
I always watch,
Cool.
you know, how they do it. I also even watch things like their posture, you know, their delivery, you know, and what they do when they are under pressure,
Yeah.
you know. So
Yeah.
it's that element as well of sort of watching and learning by observation, and just looking at what they do, even if you're doing nothing in court. And even if somebody is delivering an argument against your argument, just watching how he dismantles your argument, and then hopefully, you know, next time you can use the same sort of skill to dismantle. And now, of course, you know, the one thing that gripped me last week was watching the Supreme Court lawyers in the UK,
Yeah.
you know, and how they deploy their own craft. And it was fascinating for me to sit and watch. And of course, I mean, so there are those three things, which is, you know, just reading widely, and then watching local and international. And then, of course, you know, what you cannot substitute is hard work. It's like spending long and long hours alone, trying to figure out. Sometimes what I find with preparation is that you know what the answer is, but what will make you win a case is communicating the right answer in the right way. So you will draft the answer and then communicate the answer and realize that it's not having an impact, and then do it again and again and again until you find the right rhythm for the delivery. Because with advocacy, there has to be a balance, you know, between the written and the spoken. There has to be a balance between the right answer and its delivery. Because if you have a right answer that is delivered badly, it can be missed. Whereas sometimes you can have a bad answer, but well executed, you know, that nevertheless will have an impact. So I try to draw
a well executed answer that's wrong.
Yes, exactly. A bad answer, but well executed. So that's the thing, is trying to draw the linkages between finding the right answer, but also delivering it in a way that speaks to the fact that it's the right answer. And the last thing I would say is just remembering that judges are human. Judges, you know, respond to the human touch. You know, you can address a man intellectually, but I think until you can connect the intellect and the soul, you have still not spoken to him.
Well, I have to confess that I often watch your interventions to try and figure out how to craft my arguments. So you're not the only one.
I'm not the only one watching. I'm also being watched.
Advocate Ngcukaitobi, there are so many other things that I could canvass with you, but you've been very generous with your time. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us on SMWX.
Thank you, and well done. Congratulations. I've been a big follower and a fan of your work. And actually, last year, I must confess, I bought 5 copies of your book, and I looked for you, and I didn't look for you, I looked for Dad.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get hold of him, so I just went home and distributed 5 copies.
Wow.
So, and the people that I gave to, one of them has read it. I think the other 4 are too lazy. So thanks for the work you do. I'm really impressed, and I'm a big fan.
The feeling is more than mutual.
Yeah, thank you.
Ayeye, thanks for joining us once again on SMWX. Spread the fire, like, share and subscribe on YouTube. Join the channel, smwx.co.za. Thanks for watching the content. Like, share and subscribe on all platforms, smwx.co.za to join the WhatsApp channel. And let's build a new conversation for a new generation. Ayeye.